All right. So yeah, I'm going to start us off and then we're going to, pass it back and forth between the three of us. But first, before we get started, I just wanted to extend a huge thank you to the User Research Center. They have been an incredible resource in this project and have helped us with so many of the logistics, which, we'll walk you through today. But to give you some background about Tozzer Library, if you're not familiar with us, we're located on 21 Divinity Ave, and we primarily serve the anthropology department, the Harvard University Native American program, and the Peabody Museum, which is right next door to us. So actually back in 2013, from 2013 to 2014, Tozzer underwent a massive renovation. They basically tore down the whole building and rebuilt it. And there were a few goals with that renovation. One of them was to rethink faculty offices and to move them closer to library spaces. And as a result, we have a gorgeous new space. I can't believe it's 10 years old at this point. It's been holding up really nicely. We get a lot of positive feedback about it. But one of the areas, though, that we thought could use a bit of improvement, and I will show you in our photos here, is this lower level. So the upper level of the library, the furniture is much newer. Patrons tend to flock up there because there are large tables to work at, there are outlets. It's just a really inviting space. We've noticed, though, over the years since the renovation and since we reopened, that the lower level isn't quite as frequently used. And we suspected there were a few reasons for that. One is you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, some of the furniture downstairs was actually reused from the old library, which dates back to the 1970s. So it wasn't very accessible. It was large. You couldn't really move it around or adjust it. And the other thing we noticed was there were things like technology gaps, like this area down here. Sorry, again, I don't know if you can see or not, between behind the black chairs. Yes, thank you, Meg. Didn't have power outlets and things for people to plug in and really get down to work. So those are a few things we noticed, but we were sure that there were other things that patrons would appreciate in terms of addressing and improving. So given all of that, it felt like a good time, especially with us turning 10 this summer, to really reach out to the User Research Center and think about how we could get feedback on the lower level before we make any big decisions about changing the furniture. First, before we even did that, we talked, with finance to let them know what our budget was for this. We talked to building ops so that they had a heads up. And then, of course, we talked to the URC. And I think that wraps up my intro. So I'm going to turn things over to Meg to talk about what the process was.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Just so you folks know, I'm also facilitating the thing. So I have like 5 Zoom windows open. So if I'm looking at a place, it might be because I'm letting someone in. But let's talk about the research plan. So when Julie and Susan reached out to us, we were really excited. I personally haven't done like a full space study in a while at a library. So I just from like a purely interested UX person in library space, I was super excited to experiment with how we could answer some of the questions that we were being presented with. And the questions that we came together from our initial meeting were these, and they are the research questions for the project. So what are Tozzer community's needs in regards to space and ambiance? For example, do they want a study space, a prayer and meditation space, individual study, a quiet space, a loud space within their lower level? And what kinds of furnitures would be accessible and inclusive in regards to the type of space and ambiance? And then how might we create and place signage throughout Tozzer? So these are all things that we were kind of thinking about as a group that we wanted to tackle. There were some other questions too about artwork, but we realized as a group that maybe that wasn't necessarily the right place for this study because there's so many rules and conversations that have to take place when adding artwork to any space at Harvard. Then I thought about it and I said, there's this research method that I personally haven't used yet called a tiny cafe that I thought would be a really great way to ground the study in place and also answer those questions on the previous slide, right? So a tiny cafe is a research method where participants conduct small usability tasks in a space. And why it's called a tiny cafe is because the incentives are treats and drinks that you would normally find at a cafe. That's the name, the draw. And these usability asks are really small. They're usually no more than 5 to 10 minutes commitment for a participant. So the incentive, like a coffee or a donut, like is comparable to what you're asking them to perform as a participant, right? And like I said, to ground this in place, tiny cafes, aspect of them can be like the location. And I thought that it was really important to have a part of this study located in Tozzer itself. So we're actually reaching the participants and the community that goes to Tozzer on a regular basis to see what they thought about the space. Opposed to sending it out to our full participant pool, right? Which some of those folks maybe wouldn't even know where Tozzer Library was because they're students across the university. So that was the reason why we chose Tiny Cafe. In this image, you can see Julie, and then also some folks, Katie Kim, who is a UX intern for last semester, and then I believe a student worker, because I staged the images because I forgot to take the images while there were real people moving around in this space. But in these images, you can see some posters, and the posters have images and green dots on them. And why they have green dots, oh, it's on the next slide, I talk about the dots. But another thing that I wanted to do for this was to have touchstone tours. Touchstone tours are a method where you and the participant are walking through the space together, and the participant is giving you a tour of the space from their own understanding and preference of the space that you're looking at together, right? So as a researcher, you really focus on asking their opinions or feelings about the space as you move through it. And for the touchstone tours, we recorded these on an iPhone and then did analysis in Dovetail. I would say this is also the first time I did touchstone tours, and students were so excited to take me through a space and point out exactly what they liked. Like, for example, on these study carols, there's a hook for a like your coat. And someone was like, I love that I have a place that I can put my coat, right? So you get really rich data from touring a space with individuals. And there was a lot of overlap of their experience, which was helpful for our insights that you'll see at the end. And then also we wanted to have a opportunity to focus on HUNOP. And a focus group is a research method where all participants are asked to interview questions together. We decided to create this space to hear their feedback on Tozzer, but also relationship build between Tozzer and the Indigenous community at Harvard. That was also an important goal of having this focus group about their experience in a Tozzer Library, or what they would want even in a library space for their community. And then another part of this was a survey for staff and faculty and grad students. And this was just to make sure that we can hear from folks in an asynchronous way about their experiences in the space as well, because we are giving more weight to the student experience necessarily than the faculty and staff, but it is important to understand what they might want in a library space as well. So we decided to reach out to them through a survey. So the activities of the Tiny Cafe. Remember how I got excited about those dots? This is the slide I thought I was going to have right after that last one where I got excited about the dots. But in the Tiny Cafe, we use this process called dot voting, where each participant receives 2 to 3 dots to vote for each question that we had on the table. So for example, you can see one of these squares with images. We were asking what type of vibe students would want in the Tozzer lower level. And the 6 images had 6 different vibes, and students would vote with their 2 to 3 dots on how many ever spaces they'd want. Or they had the option to double up and put 3 dots on one space if they were like, no, this is definitively the vibe I want. Dot voting is a super easy 5 to 10 minute exercise for participants, and participants really like the act of stickers. So that was really fun as well to watch people enjoy that. And then on each question, we also had a space where people could write in comments because maybe none of the images were actually the vibe they wanted, or maybe they had a different idea about what type of furniture is important. That was another option we had as well for students to give us their feedback. Like I said, we asked about furniture. Here are some images of those furniture images we had about their preferred furniture in the space. We had vibe voting, where this is actually more space ambiance, right? Like, what feeling do you want to feel in a space? So we had some images there. We also just had words as well, not just images, but words. So like what type of space you'd want, a group space, an individual, prayer, meditation, quiet, loud, a space with movable furniture. And I'm going to pass it over to Julie and Susan to talk about image selection.
All right, I'm going to start us off. So Julie and I wanted to take a really broad approach to image gathering. We didn't want to just look at academic libraries for inspiration, though we definitely did. We also did look at other Harvard spaces. But we also wanted to look at things like public libraries, museums, community centers, student centers, offices, any place where people gather to do work or to engage in some kind of group experience. And to find these images, we, of course, Googled generally, trying combinations of words, seeing what's coming up. But we also did deep dives into various design publications and blogs. And some of these I just had to reach way back into my past when I was in an architecture library 10 plus years ago and try to remember what were some of the key places that we looked then. So things like Architect Magazine, Arc Daily, Dezeen. The ALA also has a page where they have ALA and AIA American Institute of Architects, I believe, award-winning spaces. So we were kind of combing through those, seeing what images were interesting with specifically looking for things that were maybe bright, colorful, accessible. We did some searching for accessible office spaces, for example. We looked at the Perkins School for the Blind library spaces to see how they were approaching things. And we also looked for spaces that were designed by Indigenous designers and architects. And I'm going to pass things over to Julie to talk about that piece of the process.
All right, I'm gonna move these slides up so we can see that. Yeah, sorry. So like Susan said, we went through a lot of different spaces, and looking for examples of this. This is just me dot voting again, by the way. And there's something sort of unique with like Indigenous design as well. I think I was thinking about tribal colleges and universities, like what kind of spaces did they make for their students? What kind of spaces could they do in their libraries? What kind of um, Indigenous design could they incorporate into different objects within these spaces? So like into furniture, within appliances. So the next slide, like we also like floated this as like a vibe concept. Furniture that could have Indigenous designs like incorporated onto it. I think both of these are from Indigenous Australian design kind of worked into a space. I floated this to Susan, but it's not there, it could go into anything, including even just like the material objects that are down there. So for example, Breville, which is an Australian company, has like a whole line of products that are designed by Indigenous Australian artists. And like even if this doesn't work in this sort of space, this could be something in the future where it's like if we're trying to think about more visual cues for this could be something like this. This is a beautiful tea kettle designed by these artists. Is a $400 tea kettle, which is why we had to pass on it. But it does serve as sort of an inspiration of like you know, what kind of other things could be, you know, incorporated, and not just in like, you know, if we're going to take a long time for taking art on the wall, how can we do this into furniture? How can we do this into different supplies and things that we can provide for students that are here? I think this is my part as well. And so for the event logistics, after talking with Meg, we had to do a bit of pre-planning for this event. So what, you know, we had to sit down, explain what the tiny cafe was to us, explain how that process would work, um, the kinds of logistics being done with that. So, you know, are they going to be doing the survey part of it? Are we doing it? Should we help? Who's going to be doing the food? So it was a breaking down of like the sorts of duties. So um, after talking with Meg, I think for at least two-ish meetings, we agreed that we would do provide the food. So we would locate someplace that would have good food, and so we could order that, make sure that was good, organize that along with the drinks, provide the outreach, so understanding, who could we give advertise the event to, who the event was for. So if it's for students, who should we send this to? And then any of day of support. I was the day of support. Susan was out that day. So anything that Meg needed in terms of like running the event, which turned out really great because we had the event on this first floor, but we also had the tours that were going on the second floor. So we still definitely needed people to be able to like be on each floor as the event was unrolling. And then yeah, and so then Meg and their team would be able to do the data retrieval. They gave us this wonderful flyer that we advertised well in advance, through email outreach and through just like the physical space as well, and distribute that around. This was actually it felt like, I think we only did this maybe about a month and a half ahead of time. So it was fairly quick. But it was yeah, it was much easier than we all thought, especially doing this as a team. And then in terms of the active participants that we had in the uh, during the study, we had about 30 anthropology students. There's probably a mix of other students as well. At least one student from the HUNAT focus group, and then we had 12 students that were participated in the Touchstone tours that were downstairs. I think almost everyone who did the Touchstone tour also did the dot voting um, as well. So
Okay, thanks, Julie and Susan, for that context. Um, I wanted to chat a bit about the insights, right? So we did a tiny cafe, we did the touchdown tours. We had one individual participate in the focus group, though their experience was very similar to like other things that we heard. So it was also just a great way to just add more data to our conversation, and the study as well. So we found that most folks really would like an individual study space in the lower level, or a group study space, but the individual edges out a little bit, um, as well with a quiet space being something that they would prefer over a loud space. So I think that what this shows us is that downstairs there could be a mixture of individual and group study space, but it is meant to be more of a quiet whisper, right, level, opposed to openly talking level within the space. The group study space, part of the reason why that I believe that's so high is because there is like 2 group study rooms in that basement. So there is like a designated space for more conversation if you are working with a group in that space. These are our top 3 furniture preferences. For this table, we had 26 votes. So this is more of that like collaborative individual study, maybe you go with a friend, and you sit down and you study together, or it could be for group study in the space as well. And then we had definitely higher And when it came to the individual like study nooks or study pod situation, folks were very interested in seeing those options in the Tozzer downstairs space. And then for vibe, it once again, it has like this split of like collaborative, artsy, and then like individual head down space, I would say, when we were looking at both of these vibes. Which is really interesting, but it matches what folks said when they were just looking at the words for desire of the space, right? And then we came up with some specific insights and recommendations based on the conversations we had in the Touchstone tour and the Hue Not focus group. So something that came out of that were that students really desire space sectioning and signage. So in this picture specifically, you can see the individual study carrels on the side of the building. And then you see this living room or a group conversation space in the middle right next to these individual study pods. And we had one student put it like this, though the sentiment was pretty much the same across most of the students we talked to. And they said, I feel like this is more of an individual space because of those study carrels. If people are talking in this space with the chairs, you might be uncomfortable. So having this living room situation here, it's not very comfortable for the people who are studying in those individual carrels. We also had students, while we were going through the Touchstone tour, say that the entrance to the Tozzer downstairs is imposing. As you can see in this image from one of our Touchstone tours, this is the staircase to get down to the lower level of Tozzer. It's very industrial. There is currently no signage saying like, yeah, you're going on the right way to the downstairs space. The experience from the elevator is different, right? It takes you from the upstairs to the downstairs, and there is no like in between intermediate space. One student put this specifically this way. I think for people's first time, and even for people who frequent the space, the staircases make you feel like you're in the wrong area of the building. Since there's no signage and it's not super easy to see when you first come in, especially from the top floor. The entrance is just like a door, and then you go down this staircase and then it opens up to the lower level downstairs. Related to that, we also had this other aspect where the stacks in Tozzer's libraries downstairs, if you take the stairs, it's just a big block of stacks at the entrance. It's hard to see any study space or what other technology might exist in the lower level. So this experience of looking at the stack of books from the entrance of the space this is pretty this is like how it feels is what I'm trying to get at with this image. One student put it this way: I think the stacks just create a block of wall as soon as you enter, so you don't know where you're going anymore. It throws you off. And then another thing students expressed to us was that the carrels and chairs could be updated. One student said that specifically the file cabinet part of these individual study carrels prevents someone from being able to fully use the desk and move the chair based on their needs as well. And I think Susan has something to talk about with that in a second and how it relates to another thing that she did in this process. And then there was just one note that I think also kind of gets at that tension of the individual study space and the group study space that both exists here. And we had one student say that they had an experience where they were in the group study space and were asked by a different patron to keep it down from the individual study space. So the soundproofing might not be fully as soundproof as it could be, right? And if we're thinking about the individual versus the group and wanting both of those in this space, I think there's an opportunity to have more soundproofing in a group area opposed to not. And then I'm going to pass it over to Susan to talk about what's next.
Okay, thank you. So one thing to mention that I should have mentioned earlier is that we are primarily focused on the lower space, mostly because it was the area that had the greatest need. So that's why we didn't walk through students through the upper levels, but certain things that were found in the lower levels we'll definitely implement in the upper levels as well, like signage, or to Meg's last example, the soundproofing, because when we got that feedback, it led to conversations among staff where we realized our offices, which look very similar to those study rooms, are not as soundproof as we thought. So I think there'll be a lot of opportunities to improve both levels of the space. Um, so having said all that though, next steps. So one of our big next steps we actually recently completed, and that was reaching out to University Disability Resources. They are an incredible office on campus. I can't say how much I enjoyed the walkthrough we did, how much I learned. So basically I reached out to them and they sent someone over to just walk through both levels with me, give feedback, take measurements. And as Meg mentioned, we were talking about study carrels, certain things that came up for students as just a preference also coincided with accessibility issues. So the study carrels, how students wanted more room to just move around. They didn't want to be confined by the drawers. That's also an accessibility issue because wheelchair users can't really get in and use those desks. Oh yeah, thank you for going ahead there. So doing that was really helpful and is helping us think through the student feedback with a different lens. And yeah, I have a link up there to the office generally. And I think if you reach out, they'll connect you with the specific person, Catherine, who does spaces. We also mentioned a survey. So we're in the process of distributing a survey to faculty, staff, and graduate students. As Meg mentioned, we wanted to give folks an asynchronous option. We were hoping that we would get feedback from people who maybe aren't in the library as much. So for example, faculty. We still really want to know what they think, but because they have offices, they're not using the library as much as students. So we thought that a survey would be best for them for that reason and the fact that they're just really busy. We also thought a survey would be good for our graduate students because a lot of anthropology graduate students tend to go and do field work for extended periods of time. So there might be people who have a lot of thoughts but are out of the country right now. So we are looking forward to getting that feedback in addition to what we've already gathered. Other next steps, I'll also be circling back to the department, to the museum, to HUNAP, just to keep them all updated on the process. Before this whole thing started, I made sure to make announcements at faculty meetings to just try to generate interest and hopefully buy-in and that people would participate going forward. So I'd like to circle back with all of those different groups, especially because we're hoping that once we review all the data, we can work with building ops to start ordering furniture examples. And we would really like to invite people in to actually test things out before we just go ahead and order a bunch of things. And so we're hoping by keeping the conversation going and just keeping people updated, they'll be more interested in coming into the library physically to help us out with that piece. Let me see what else. So I mentioned this earlier, but we've just made sure to keep library and Tozzer building operations folks updated on the process. They've been very helpful in, letting us know what seems reasonable, thinking about timelines. Also, it's just, helpful for them because they have a lot of different projects on their plate. So it's great that they know what we're doing and kind of where we're at in the process. And one of the things that I think we'll probably be able to implement a little sooner than furniture are things like soundproofing spaces and other changes like that. They've also been really helpful in helping us think through who to go through for different types of signage. I know that I believe Library Communications is rolling out some new signage templates that we might be able to use for certain things. And then for other more permanent signage, like for example, where the elevator is, that's something we would work with a different group on. So they've been really helpful in helping us navigate those different pieces. And then Meg mentioned art. So art is something we're very much interested in at Tozzer, but we wanted to acknowledge that it was such a big conversation. We felt like it should be a separate conversation. So we are hoping to work with the FAS Chief Campus Curator, Brenda Tyndall, on thinking through art, especially how we could maybe commission new art for the space. Prior to this, we had very old art based on the collections. It wasn't very inclusive. In some cases, it was extremely offensive. So we just want to be very careful in how we think about the art that we showcase in that space. So that will be a way down the road next step. Hopefully not too far though, because we've had blank walls for quite a while, unfortunately. I think that is it for me. So I think we're gonna move on. Sorry, I keep forgetting to zoom forward to our lessons learned. Meg, do you want to lead us through?
Yeah, there were just a couple of lessons learned, right? I mentioned at the beginning of this that this was a method that I've always been interested in, but I haven't ever done before or conducted. So there are a couple of things that I would do differently. Like in any project, it's always a learning experience too, right? Something that we had talked about that honestly, I had forgot the bag that had the sign-up sheet in it. But we had talked about having a sign-up sheet for students who come who would be interested in talking about this topic further. So whether that be in an interview about the furniture options that Susan was talking about, or just a follow-up survey or conversation of some kind based on what we had learned. Currently, we don't have that sheet because, like I said, that's on me. I forgot it. But I would say I think that's a good idea for a space study of any kind, is to have some type of way of letting folks, if they're interested, add their email to a list so you can follow up with future questions that you may have about the space with those individuals. Another thing that I think I would change is having the touchstone tours be individual. There were a couple of times where it was like a group of 2 students who were like, can we do it together? And I was like, sure, let's see what happens, because this was also a method I had never tried. And in that experience, some individuals talked more than the other person, which is also a thing that happens in focus groups at times. So I think if I were to do touchstone tours again, I would have it be individual opposed to 2 people at the same time. And Julie, do you want to talk about yours?
Yeah, I think one of the things
Oh,
I noticed was that in the advertisement, so in the flyer and the other piece about we're having a tiny cafe, um, it didn't go into specifics of who the tiny cafe was for, and so I think it was confusing because it's like we wanted to focus on undergrad and graduate students that were student usage of the space, and there were some individuals that came in, but they were library staff or some other sort of area. And yeah, so in terms of like who we were looking for to get feedback for it wasn't specified enough in the advertising, and so it just led to some confusion. And that could go into also just like the tiny cafe as an idea, since I think most people weren't aware that it was maybe a survey type situation. So yeah, having a good amount of specificity about what the event is and who the event is looking for feedback is definitely good.
Okay, and then the only thing I would add is just thinking through timing in the semester a little bit more and getting feedback from the department on that. We did this in November, so there were a lot of holidays happening. Julie and I had conferences we were attending, so we picked what date worked best for us and kind of hoped that it would work okay for students. But I think going forward with like furniture selection, for example, we'd really want to work with the department a little bit more so that we could ensure it's a time that really works well for students. And I'm sorry if you see a little red laser, that's just my automatic cat toy zooming around the room. So sorry about that.
And then we just wanted to say thank you and open the floor for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.